93.6 Global Radio's return to Eldorado with Dave James.
On the show today, we're delving behind the scenes of Eldorado with some exclusive photos and videos. I'm talking to Mike Kenyon from his home in the UK. Mike, what was your profession in the early 90s?
Oh, well, that's a tricky questions first. No, I'm an electrical engineer. Basically, I started out in the power generating industry and then moved on to consultancy and so on.
And how did you become involved with Eldorado as an electrical engineer?
We were setting up a studio in Spain. That's basically how I got involved in it.
And what were your thoughts on the project when they were telling you what it was going to be?
Well, we loved the idea when it came up. We'd been working on the studio about a year before the BBC gave the green light on the programme. And we heard shortly after we set up the first studio that was what was going to be happening. So it was a great concept to work with, but I have to say it was about 10 months before we actually got around to going ahead with it in real life.
Well, if we go back to the very beginning, you've shared with me some fantastic photos, which we're going to be talking about and run in the background of our little chat. If we start with this picture that's on the screen right now, we'll start with this because it's an important picture. Who are these people that we're looking at now?
Well, this is a picture that was taken about quite a few months before it actually started, or May 1991. And this is at the first studios. We called it the Me House Film Studios. And the people involved in there, I'm the person with the T-shirt on in the middle. On one side of me is Verity Lambert with Max, our studio dog. And Julia Smith, who produced the programme, is next to Renee, who ran the little restaurant that we have up there. So that was basically one of the very early discussion groups that was happening when Verity and Julia Smith came across to have a look at the programme.
And I love that there was a studio dog as well. That's brilliant.
Yeah, he was an adopted one as well, actually. He was well known around the area, but Max was renowned for the crew and cast there.
So looking at the Me House Film Studios, this building, this white building we're looking at here now, this is the Me House Film Studio. What role did this play in the Eldorado story?
Yeah, well, this is the little studio that we'd taken over. It was originally built in 1971 by the American filmmaker, Eddie Volkovich. Anyway, he'd left Spain and we took that over. And we'd been running that for commercials and various other things. In fact, they use the pool areas, one the LCID, the LCID program with John Bird. And, so they were on that. And this was set up as the first production offices when eventually we got the green light to go ahead with the project.
Was any filming actually done at these Me House studios?
Well, we didn't actually do anything. We had a few still photography groups come through, rent facilities for us.
In the creation of Eldorado, I imagine that the fictional town of Los Barcos all began with this model that we're looking at now.
Yes, this was shortly after we'd had the go-ahead on it, and Keith Harris had got together. I'd spent a bit of time with him going around the place, but this is a concept that he came up with. And this model was shipped out from England, where Keith had put it together out of cardboard boxes on the kitchen table. And he shipped it out, and this was the first model of Eldorado. And it really didn't change that much from that model to the real thing.
But I find very interesting looking at the model. It gives you a really good perspective of where everything should be in the town, where, of course, in reality, the filming locations were much more spread out than that, weren't they?
They certainly were. We spent a lot of time looking around for various locations. And then we realized that with the production this big, we really couldn't do it without a set location and a home. And that's when we came up with the idea that we'd had right from the very beginning to use the land at Karim. Now, the way it's set, and you'll probably see this a little bit later, is that there's a cut line or there's illusions that create the effect that the set is as you see on the model there, but in reality it's actually in different locations geographically.
This picture we're looking at now shows that site at Kenyon. I've been to see it many times myself, but it is here. This picture, I presume, was taken before construction started. It's just like a forest scene, isn't it, with a road through it?
This was taken about a year before it actually happened. We didn't even know the Little England or Eldorado project was on the cards at that time. But I went up to the top of the fire break with a couple of other people. And this is looking back down on it. And the Eldorado set was eventually built on the right-hand side of that fire break, which became the access road.
What is being built at the minute? It looks like a prefab classroom from a school.
But that's basically effectively what it is. Time was very short to actually get the whole thing together. So the biggest thing to do was to get the art production offices and so on together. And the easiest way of doing that was actually buying modular buildings. And this is one of the modules that the buildings were made of, being set up on site.
The production crew, was that mainly made up of local Spanish people from the Costa del Sol, or was it an English crew brought over?
It was a mixture of all, actually. There were predominantly English-speaking people started. There were quite a lot of people that had been working on other TV programs, such as The Bill. They came across, and of course EastEnders. So they were the hardcore, if you like, of the crew. But we also had Canadians, Australians, and then we also had quite a lot of the Spanish crew. And a lot of those started off and were getting a lot of experience in the industry, learning on the job. And if you look at the credits of the programs, you actually see quite a lot of the names on those, particularly during the later episodes, once they'd had a bit of training and certainly worked way up into the more senior positions on the program.
Looking at this picture of a set here now, Mike, this looks to me like the famous Los Barcos shopping centre. Can you remember which parts were put up first?
Well, the building was done in such a way that we use conventional Spanish building techniques. Most of the construction crew was Spanish. So instead of trying to build a film set or get people to build a film set, we built in the conventional way from the ground up. Some of them had interiors, some of them didn't. So effectively it went from the ground up, and all the peripheral things. In fact, the picture that you've got there with I think that's got the flags flying on top. That's where the tower went on top of the commercial centre eventually, but that was actually made in the carpentry workshop.
And this next picture we have here, this is going to be one of the villas. Now, I'm trying to remember which characters lived in villas. You had the Lockheads, you had Bunny and Fizz had a villa as well. Do you know which one this is that we're looking at?
It's funny, I had difficulty identifying it. I actually had a look at some of the old documents I've got lying around. But it was actually Bunny and Fizz's villa, which was actually physically right next to the Lockheads villa.
Something that surprised me when I went to see the sets recently is that the exterior of all the villas has changed slightly. Doors have moved places. You can still see on the wall where the Don Roman sign was next to Bunny's front door, but the front door's not where it was when it was filmed. Have you any idea why they would have moved that?
Well, after we'd moved out of it, the site was taken over by a hotel chain, and they were trying to use some of the villas and some of the apartments for accommodation, so people could actually live in the places where they'd seen the TV actors working. So I think it was done really from that point of view to actually make them more usable as accommodation for the guests.
Now, something that fascinates me, Mike, when you watch, say, a TV show like EastEnders, when they film outside, that they knock on the front door and then the characters go inside, but in reality, they're not going into that building, they're then going onto a soundstage somewhere. In Eldorado, it was very different, wasn't it? The interiors were actually the interiors of the buildings that we were seeing from the outside.
The vast majority of them were. They were working sets. So, yes, that's correct. But certain other of the sets that we used, you would see people going into. I think the most prominent example of that is the old church in the old town. That's just a facade. So when you see people going into it, they're just going into the forest behind the facade. And the actual interiors would have been shot in a real church that we'd hired for the...
Here is an interior shot, Mike, of one of the buildings. This looks like it's going to be a teenage boy's room, isn't it?
Yes, that was Blair's. That was Blair Lockhead's room. And that was after the set dressers had been in and actually set it all up for him.
Looking at the interior of that set, on the TV they look really quite spacious, but in reality they're very small, aren't they? Did that prove problematic for filming?
It was a big problem because being so small, you've got to get the whole crew in there, not just the camera and lighting. So it is very difficult. And in the height of summer, it is also very, very hot. You could work through windows and some walls were left out. So you could move a wardrobe out of the way, for instance, and actually take some shots through there. But the cameras that we used actually have a very wide angle of field. So they give the impression that it's a lot larger than it is. I mean, this is to the extent that you even had to put some of the furniture up on, raise them up on platforms to make them look as though they're actually a real living room.
If we take a look at this next slide here, Mike, this is a bunch of guys. Looks like they're looking out over the area where the set was built. Can you remember what's going on here?
Yes, that was in the early days. They've got the access roads that are built on the main set, but they haven't laid anything out. Now, the person on the left is Keith Harris, and he's got most of the art department and the other personnel around. And he's basically indicating where he's going to put things and how it's going to be put together. So that was Keith Harris looking after that. The next photograph was of a couple of the Spanish workers. They used to have a bit of time off and post photographs from me now and again. Then the picture following with all those behind, that's Keith Harris again, having a bit of time out. Now, the next photograph with everybody sitting on an access road, that's of the group of people in front of the 4x4. That was taken on the access road at the early stages of the production. Really, I'd better go from left to right on those. The first person on the left is Pepe Tomas, who was the Spanish chap who was in charge of the whole of the construction process. He did a great job. Next to him was Armando Jimenez, who I'd known for quite a time. He runs his own production company, but he also got involved in a big way with the project. And then, let's see, the next person hiding behind Keith Harris is Greg Dark. He's one of John Dark's sons. He was involved quite a lot in the beginning stages as well. And then we've got Keith Harris, the designer of the set. Next to him is Julia Smith, who is a producer. Sitting on the bonnet is John Dark, who is one of the executive producers in the Spanish side. I'm just in front of him in the blue shirt. And next to me, I can't quite remember this person's name, but he was a Spanish architect. I think it is Ignacio, but I can be corrected on that one. But he briefly put the whole of the architecture together on that. Moving on to the next one, this is the first crew that came around, and that's Julia Smith basically showing them around the set as it is under construction. And the final photograph shows the commercial centre tower that was going to be lifted up onto the top of the commercial centre. And that was based on the one that was actually in Calahonda, the El Zoco Commercial Centre.
So you mentioned El Zoco in Calahonda. Did real-life locations like that provide a lot of inspiration for the building work that you were doing?
Oh, absolutely. We chased around in the early stages. I spent a lot of time with Keith Harris and Tony Hollins, showing them all these places in the early days of the planning. And that's where a lot of the inspiration came from.
We're now looking at people actually on the sets. I think that looks like the entry to the commercial centre. But I heard that the sets weren't even finished when filming for the show itself began. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely true. I think we were filming the first 18 episodes simultaneously, and we were working around the construction process. I mean, it was being put together in an incredibly short time. And we had deadlines to meet for the BBC for the first episodes to go out. But it made it very difficult for everybody concerned. First of all, the crews could only shoot in certain areas that were completed. You had the noise of construction that was possibly a problem. And secondly, the actors who had not, particularly the less experienced actors on it, they couldn't get their head around the storylines because in the morning they'd probably be shooting a scene from episode 18. Then in the afternoon, for example, they could be shooting a scene from episode 1. So none of the storylines would have made any kind of sense when you came to actually filming them. Obviously they do when you read the scripts, but trying to get your head around that is a huge problem.
Here it looks like someone's getting a guided tour of the set facility. Can you remember what's going on in this picture, Mike?
Oh, yeah, that was another one. That was the whole of the production crew. I think this is the first production crew. So you've got Julia Smith. There's a couple of the camera people there that also did a bit of directing. Jeff Feld directed a few episodes as well, to be a senior cameraman. John Daly was another one. So, yeah, I mean, you've got all the crew members. Some of them will be the sound people, some of them will be camera, some lighting. So, yeah, they were getting to look around the sets and work out what their shooting possibilities would be.
And on this one, it looks like a very large paella event is happening. What was this all about?
Well, this is a Spanish tradition. In fact, I think it's a worldwide tradition, if the truth be known. When you've finished the building, you get the rooftops off. Even before you started to do the interiors, you fly the flags, which is, you probably saw it on the previous program, previous shot of the commercial centre. When they've topped it off, they have a big party for all the construction crew. So this was the paella, and it served about 200 odd people that did. The person who was in charge of putting it all together was actually a local chief of police. So he put the whole thing together. The second photograph shows John Dark and James Tedesco, who were the executive producers of the Spanish company. They're lending their hands, stirring it all. And then the third one was actually a picture of basically the Spanish workforce enjoying the paella and one or two drinks as well.
Here it looks like someone's having a view from one of the rooftops or one of the apartments. Do you know what we're looking at here, Mike?
Yeah, well, this is another shot of the early production crew going around having a look. Now, I think this is probably from, might have been from Trish's apartment balcony, but that was before the railings had even gone up. So they got a prime view there over the whole of the Pueblo, the Los Barcos urbanization as it will become.
You've also put together a time-lapse video, which we're going to run in the background right now. This shows the buildings on the run-up to the main square being constructed. Now, can you remember how much time passed from the beginning to the end of this?
Yes, well, this was looking up at the church and the edifice there. It was approximately 3 months through the whole construction period until the set was finished. I say roughly because some of the dressings and so on that were being done to the set afterwards probably went on a little bit farther. But I would say roughly 3 months from the start of the construction process.
And how did you all feel when it was finally finished?
Well, I think it was a great achievement. I mean, we were amazed at how the Spanish construction crew had managed to pull the whole thing together in such a short time. We'd been working around the trees and so on to try to keep it as natural as possible without actually having to plant more plants afterwards and so on. But yeah, it's absolutely great achievement.
We've talked about how the layout of the town was very different from, of course, the actual filming locations in a geographical sense. Looking at this picture here, can you point out the main reference points for me?
Yeah, if you look at the Carretera de Mijas, that is actually the cutting line. So the shopping plaza is the commercial centre on the set. The old town to the left is the one with the church and the fountain. And the Urbanización Las Terrazas is the main area where all the main characters were living. Now, the marina was actually in Puerto Capabino on the coast. And this is what I was talking about, the cutting line a bit earlier, is that the Carretera was actually the cutting line. So you could imagine that you could walk from the urbanization straight into the marina by walking underneath a tunnel to the marina. In real life, it wasn't that, but that was the illusion that was intended.
At top right of the picture, Mike, there's a lake. Now, on the actual site at Coin, there is also a big lake, but I don't think we ever saw that in the show. Do you know what the intention was with this?
Yeah, that was required for fire regulations. Remember, we built in the forests, and we'd got the fire break that was also the access road. And part of the regulations were that we had to have a ready supply of water in case they needed aerial firefighting capability. So that was built, and it had access so helicopters could come in and refresh from there in order to fight a forest fire locally.
This one we're looking at now, Mike, this, certainly for fans of the show, this is going to be quite special, isn't it? Because it's showing which characters lived where. How long have you had this for?
Yeah, I've had that right from the very beginning. This is the earliest stages when we were still working hard. If you have a close look at it, you'll see that some of the apartments are actually marked with things like just being holiday flats for let and so on. So a lot of those were for future storylines that never actually made it. But there was a lot of extra expansion built into it for that purpose.
And then this is the equivalent representation of the church square where Marcus Tandy's apartment was. It's fascinating, isn't it, to see what the buildings were intended to be used for. Can you remember how many of these were actually just shells and how many of them had functioning interiors?
I would say, on the guesswork, probably in the old town we had the fewer functioning shells there. The Marcus's apartment was one of the ones that did function, and also the Fernandez's villa and the Duke's apartment. They were all functioning. There was the newspaper shop with the cafe next to it was a functioning set, but the bank wasn't. I think the interior of the police station was fitted out, but I'm a little bit vague on some of those. I think that happened later in the construction process. Now, the really interesting one on all this is actually the theatre. The theatre lobby was the one that was actually used as a working set. But the technical block and the rooms above it on the second floor, they were used more for the post-production purposes.
And this is the same type of diagram for the commercial centre. Inside the commercial centre, so you got Bunny's restaurant, you got Joy's bar, the video shop, all those bits and pieces, even the petrol station outside. In the bar, for example, did the beer pumps work? In the restaurant, were the kitchens real?
Yes, to a certain extent. Video production shop, that wasn't obviously connected to anything else. Any of the images that you saw on the TV screens were there. They were driven off a VCR to make it look as though it was real. Joy's bar had a keg underneath the bar, so you could actually pull a pint of beer there. But very little was actually plumbed in from that basis. So yes, they were sets, but they were used mainly for, if you like, when they put the lighting and everything else in to actually make it work. Now the Repsol station was a different one. That was not working at all because the regulations will be very stiff to try to get something working from that basis, to get all the required permits to have a real fuel there. So that was just a mock-up.
I can imagine that would have been a recipe for disaster, wouldn't it?
So we might have been able to use the lake.
We've spoken a little bit about the post-production and the editing that was going on that building near the theatre. If we look here, if we look at this picture, now this is inside what looks to us now like very old-fashioned dated equipment, but at the time, this was state-of-the-art, wasn't it? What are we looking at here?
This was actually one of the two offline editing suites. So these used SVHS tapes that were made from the original digital tapes, and they were just basically for putting the whole thing together into a form that produced a program. So yes, it was not particularly state-of-the-art equipment even at that time. It was commercially available Panasonic SVHS editing equipment.
Now, I heard a rumour, Mike, that there is a lost Eldorado episode. An episode that apparently was so bad, I think someone told me it was mainly Bunny and Fizz on a beach somewhere, but it was so bad it never actually made it onto the TV. Is that just a rumour, or do you know if there's any truth behind that?
There's a little bit of truth in that. There were a couple of anomalies that I came across in the episode numbering. There was two in the early stages. Episodes 31 and 32 were actually combined into one. and there is actually no episode 33. So I don't think it was a lost episode as such, but it was one that was actually re-edited to make two into one to do it. But there's a little bit of confusion because a little bit later on, there was another episode number that was missed, and that was number 126. Now, I've no idea what happened to that and why that got canned as such. I don't know if that was the one that was too bad or whether it was never put into it in the first place. But, your guess is as good as mine as to whether there is actually one that exists. I've never seen one. I've heard about it, but I've never actually seen one, so I don't think it actually existed. It never reached the editing process.
Urban myths in Los Barcos. The picture we're looking at now, I understand, was taken at the end of filming. Did you take this one yourself?
Oh, yes. Yeah. In fact, all the pictures that you've been shown are mine, except the one that I bought from Los Barcos website. Yeah, this is one I took. I took this in what was the theatre building, which is effectively the post-production department. And this is the stairs between the editing suites upstairs and the dubbing suites downstairs. Now, everybody who was along there, if they reached the end of a stint of productions and so on, they used to write a message for those that followed, and I suppose leaving their little bit of graffiti, their little bit of notes as to how much they enjoyed doing it or what problems they had and so on. So it was, in many ways, a very personal record for the people involved on that. Remember, this area was never open to the general public, and very seldom did, and most of the cast and crew even come into that unless they had some business to do with Eldorado. So, yes, this was a personal memory.
This picture, right, this is clearly a whiteboard, but I can see lots of things about final copies, final this, final that. Is this right at the end? What is this?
Yes, if you look along the top of the whiteboard, you'll see the episode numbers, everything from 146 through to 158, which was the last episode. Now, this was a rotating progress. So we kept a progress report as we went along. When it was wiped off the end, the next one would take its place. And these were all the stages that it went through. The first cut, second cut, and third cut would be the ones that would be made in the offline editing suite. And then when it comes into the online editing with the digital copies, that's when it comes into the online progress, final, in the middle of the board, final online settings and so on. And then they produced the transmission master, and also did the audio dubbing onto it to get the audio totally set up for the final product. It's a bit of a thing because, these are the last episodes I worked on. If you see checked by right at the bottom or near the bottom, that's me signing them off. I was the last person to see the tapes before they actually went off to the BBC. So I did the final technical checks on the tapes to make sure that the quality was up to standard. Yep.
So, mate, if we look to the left of the picture, I can read Eldorado 2. Is that ITV Bites Back?
Well, we had a lot of comedians in the post-production team, so everybody would leave their little message and wonder if there was going to be a future. I don't know if it's wishful thinking or whether they just thought, well, maybe ITV will take over the BBC didn't want to continue with it.
And on to our final shot now. This must be quite an emotional picture for you to look at, Mike. It's because there's a message for you on the bottom right, isn't there?
Yes. That's one of the last comedians. I was basically the last person on the payroll, except for the line producer, or actually the series co-producer, David Shanks, and the accountant who was, of course, paying us. So it was, the last few days of working in post-production was a very lonely place. Everybody, all the light had gone out of it, and I was just at the end. So yes, it was sad to see it, and yes, I did turn out the lights when I left.
The last to leave the building. Mike, when Eldorado finished, it must have been a big wrench in your life. What did you do after the show was over?
Well, I took stock a little bit. Some people were going to try to stay on and get an alternative production and so on going there, but it would have, in many ways, it would have been a poor thing to go on to from my point of view. So I decided not to go ahead with that. When it first, just before I walked out for the last time, I actually walked around the whole set again, had a look at it, and then toasted it with a couple of wee drams to help things along. But after about 6 months, I'd left Spain and I moved to New Zealand and then on to Australia. So I'd moved around a little bit up to that since then. It was a sad wrench, but it was also nice to go back to the set about 10 years later and have a look at what it had become. And that was when it had been run by the hotel group.
Mike, it's been thoroughly enjoyable and really interesting to hear your stories about what was going on the other side of the camera. Thank you so much for joining me on this one.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's great to share it because I think it was a great achievement by all the people that did it, all the cast crew, whether they're from the Spanish side or whether even from any other nationalities that were involved. It was a really great production. And it really worked well at the end, but unfortunately, the decision had been taken a long time before that to can it, which was a shame. But very good memories, like I say.
You broke lots of new ground, did lots of new things, and created a show which 25 years later, so many people are still talking about, which is a real testament to your work. Mike, it's been great to chat. Thank you so much for sharing these fantastic pictures with us.
Oh, great pleasure. Anytime.
93.6 Global Radio's return to Eldorado with Dave James.